across the water there. So thanks. I guess we'll start. This is our first panel of the 2022 Miskatonic Repository Con. This is called Getting Creative with Cthulhu. And the purpose of this panel is to help folks who are looking for ways to do something new, to do something a little bit out of the ordinary with their Cthulhu writing for the Miskatonic Repository. We are joined by Mike Mason, Paul Frigger, and Heinrich Mohr, and I will ask you to introduce yourselves there. And for folks who are watching, just to reiterate, if you could please put your questions in the Zoom chat. There's only the one of me doing moderation and chat trolling, so I don't have the bandwidth to monitor the Discord as well. So, Mike, I guess we'll start with you.
Hi, I'm Mike. I'm the creative director of Call of Cthulhu at Chaosium, but I think you all know that already. It's a pleasure to be here, and I hope you've all got some wonderful questions and things to talk about. Looking forward to it.
And Paul?
Hi, I'm Paul Fricker. I write for Call of Cthulhu, and I'm one of the hosts of the Good Friends of Jackson Elias podcast. Pleased to be here. This should be a fun evening, and anything stupid I say is because I've had a couple of glasses of wine and just chilling out.
And Heinrich?
Did you bring enough wine for everyone, Paul?
I didn't. No, I drank it all.
That is a shame. My name is Heinrich Mohr. I am an author on the Miskatonic Repository Chaosium's community content program on Drive-Thru RPG, as well as one of the organizers for this convention. I'm very excited to be here.
Thank you. We're happy to have you. And one of the reasons that I've invited these panelists particularly is because I think they have some keen insight into the specific types of things we're getting at. For example, Mike has kind of an overview over the entirety of Call of Cthulhu and what's happening and the trends of what people are writing and what people are buying. Paul, among his many other talents, somehow induced over 500 people to buy a scenario about a whaling ship in the 1850s. And Heinrich has gone gold as well with something that is not even a scenario, but is in fact a character creation guide. So I chose them as well for being examples of some of the new and interesting things that we might try. So what I want to start with is, I guess, a discussion of the structure of the scenario. And I think, Mike, this is something we've talked about a little bit before, that there's kind of the standard plot, right, of racing to stop a cult, right? You found out that someone's up to no good. You've got to stop them before they summon something. And what I'd like to explore with you all are your thoughts on ways that we can depart from that entirely or remix it to keep it fresh and do something new with it. If there's something that you've read or played that does that very well that you want to call out, that's great. And we'll kind of start there.
Yeah, okay. I think I tend to view Call of Cthulhu scenarios in kind of two, maybe three chunks, and they are very much geared to the audience. If I tend to look at it this way, you're either a newcomer to some degree to the game, and therefore playing what more experienced and older players who've been doing it for years and years, you tend to play the scenarios we all played when we started, which is how it works. You play the Haunting or what's to call it? I can't think of the names of any of the scenarios in the
Edge of Darkness. Probably.
Any of those, Edge of Darkness, and indeed on the repository, there's a lot of scenarios that are short play. In the mold of, there may not be a haunted house, but in the mold of a haunted house, there's a single location, something weird going on. You react to it, maybe get away or solve the situation, and that's one kind of chunk of scenarios, and they serve a very legitimate purpose because they actually help people to understand and get into the game, and so as long as there's more people coming to play the game, there's always a need for that style of scenario. Then you have you've got like the middle chunk, which is your kind of more in-depth scenarios, and so on. And then, then I guess you can chunk it out to kind of saying, your very complex kind of things, your big campaigns, your massive and adept. Those are the kind of three branches I tend to think about scenarios in when I'm thinking about scenarios. But in terms of dealing with the core, I mean, okay, let's face it. There's three core Call of Cthulhu scenarios that we see time and time again. Or I do. There's the cult. Stop the cult before they summon the bad thing. There's a group of people putting on the play called the Yellow Sign, and then there's the there's the monster on the loose. Yeah, the thing has appeared from wherever and is eating people, and you've got to stop it. Those are your three core Call of Cthulhu scenarios, and a lot of scenarios are a variation on that theme. I am really simplifying it down. Don't get me wrong, but and so what you're talking about here is saying, well, what if we don't do any of those things? What can you do? And I think there are examples out there, and I know Paul has written some of them, for example. But I mean, I tend to these days, if I'm putting something together for a convention, I very rarely use a cult these days. I mean, I might have a villainous person, but actually, I want to explore the mythos more and kind of more weird. I want to be more weird. So I'm really at the moment certainly kind of hooked on kind of spells, and the idea that spells go wrong and spells do things beyond what we think they do. I kind of alluded to this in the Grand Grimoire in the intro kind of stuff about magical residue. I like the idea of things being corrupted or infected by the mythos, not just humans being corrupted through insanity, but the actual land. I kind of like riffing on folk horror to some degree. So spells going wrong, spells acting strange, or not even aware there's a spell going on, and you're in the middle of it. That's why strange things are happening, and part of your job is to kind of just get out of this. But if you can work out there's a spell involved or some kind of thing going on, then all to the better. I obviously I can go on, but I'll shut up at this point because that's one idea. There you go. One new thing. Go with something around spells.
Okay. And Paul or Heinrich?
Well, I just wanted to say, I just think it's great. Mike just said that a third of the scenarios he gets are just people putting on the Yellow King.
It seems like that some days. It's not true.
I can't argue.
No, I mean, I was horrified to think that my first scenario on the repository was in fact a King in Yellow scenario. My second one didn't, and my third one there is a monster on the loose. So testament of proof.
Yeah. I mean, I think two big divisions for me would be scenarios that are heavily or centered around investigation. So one of the things we kind of use in the structure of the way we present the scenarios is putting in leads at the end of sections. The investigators have gone through this section. What kind of things might they have picked up on, which is going to take them to a different section in the scenario? And then there's some that are just situational. And you look at the section and you're like, well, there aren't any leads there, but some more crazy stuff's going to happen down the line to them. They're not necessarily, the characters can react to it, what's happened, but there aren't necessarily like clues. So I think don't stress about it being overly investigative always, although it is described as an investigative horror game often. I think when it comes to creating there's another two things. I think structure. I think the structure that we have, that Chaosium has for the way we structure the scenarios, that seems pretty effective to me. So we've got like the intro, we've got the dramatis personae, we've got maybe a timeline. And then we've got various scenes, then we've got the monster and character stats at the end. And that seems a very effective way of communicating the scenario. So sometimes I look at scenarios, to edit or whatever, and they haven't really adopted that structure that well. So it's easy to kind of take what you've got and kind of, reshape it into that structure, and it just communicates everything more effectively. I'll let Heinrich jump in.
So you talk about one of the things that I think I heard you mention was scenes that are more for establishing theme and mood.
Yeah, I mean,
right?
some of the scenes I've just been working on recently, it's like I'm looking through the scene, I'm thinking, okay, well, what kind of what clues are they going to pick up in this scene? Well, they're not really going to pick up any clues, but there's foreshadowing of what comes later, or there's just some creepy atmosphere stuff, or there's just some interesting things that will come to mean things later in the scenario, but they're not clues to act on right now.
Yeah, I think I've. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, please.
No, I was just going to warn everyone that while you'll get good advice from Mike and Paul, I'll be the one providing advice that is maybe more reflective of some of the things that I think is really great about the Miskatonic Repository, which is, we get to make sort of mistakes and try weird things. So note that sometimes I will say things and I don't mean to suggest that it's a good idea, but it might be an interesting idea. And sometimes that's enough. In addition to writing down all the things that Mike and Paul were saying, focusing on your question about structure, Evan, one thing that I think folks have done effectively, but that there's still more scope to explore, is to start in unexpected places. So the usual structure of a story with its beginning, middle, and end can be rewritten or taken to a different place if you begin at the end, right? If you just suppose, okay, the cult has done the thing it wanted, what's the bad thing that's happened, and now how do the investigators pick up the pieces, or how do they undo it, or something along those lines. You see this a lot when investigators don't have their memories, like when they have memory loss. So that can be a way of spurring creativity in your story structure. Another thing, playing off what Mike mentioned, would be to think about your structure not in terms of beginning, middle, and end or scenes, but roles. What role does this item play? What role does this individual play? And based on that, are you able to have a structure where, rather than everything going around a set of scenes A, B, C, D, do you have something that is going to just change depending on what the roles are impacted against each other, right? So if they use the item in this way, or if someone gets a hold of this item, will they do something that, spirals the story off in a different direction? And then the last thing I'll say before I shut up is anytime you are playing with structure, I think and I think just generally good advice, is always asking yourself, what are the creative decisions that are available to investigators? So if you have a scenario where in any given scene you can think of numerous dozens different things that investigators might do that are interesting, that will lead to interesting results, you're probably on your way to playing with structure, because those things are going to happen and it's going to compel the story in a particular way. And so that's sort of a little mark for yourself, right, as you're writing, is what are the creative decisions? And that's also a way of avoiding railroading, which is another risk when you're playing with structure.
I'm going to jump in and I'm going to say what I said at Necronomicon. Railroading is a part of every role-playing game ever written. It's a fallacy that it doesn't take place, and it's not a bad thing. It's a bad thing when you stop player agency.
Right. But
every role-playing game is some form of railroad. It's a scale, and I've listened to this for many years about don't railroad the players. I disagree in terms of it is a railroad. It's a plot, and it's got a beginning, middle, and an end. And unless the players go off, and make their own stuff as they go, they're going to follow this railroad that's called a plot or structure. So, I'm rah. That's what I'm just saying that out there. Not. I agree with everything Heinrich said, but I just thought I'd jump in on the railroad thing.
Yeah, no, that's. Oh, sorry. Go
ahead. The other aspect to think about is the style of game. Paul kind of talked about, Call of Cthulhu being known as an investigative horror game. And yes, predominantly because it role plays very well. The game works very well because of its investigative nature. It gives the players agency to explore and seek out clues and, put pieces together. And we all enjoy a good mystery. That's why crime drama is the most popular drama. It's why you turn on a TV any night of the week and there is a cop program on, or some detective or whatever, because we love it. And so Call of Cthulhu, emulates that to some degree. However, you don't have to. You can just stick with the horror and forget the investigation, which is often a lot of one shots. And I know I've said this before, but the kind of think of a scenario like a horror film, and therefore it can start, as Heinrich said, at any point. You don't need we're gathering you all together because it's a mystery we want you to go and look at. Well, they're all in the coffee shop when the Shoggoth comes through the window. That's the start of the scenario, or The Walking Dead or whatever it is. So you can change the scope of the scenario by the style of the scenario, and we tend to focus on things like survival horror, investigative horror, but Call of Cthulhu is many things. It can be exploration, it can be particularly with Paul, very action orientated, and so the very minimal, if no investigation at all, just one explosion after the other in that sense. So you can think about the style of the scenario you're trying to put together, and you can go back to the drawing board and go, actually, what level of investigation do I want in this? Do I want it to be really investigative, and in fact just like a crime drama until the very end, when they catch the villain, they pull off the mask and he's got a deep one under there or whatever, rather than something else. But or is it really minimal? So I think that's the kind of thing to throw into the mix if you're thinking about trying to shake things up a bit.
Yeah, and I think in service to the audience who I think are current or aspiring creators for their repository, right? So when you're playing with structure, you're playing with maybe subverting some of the classic expectations of the game. We've gone back and forth in other discussions about how much playtesting is needed, what's the right way to playtest. But this, I think, is one of those areas where you're going to want to do some playtesting, right? Because it can be hard to get that across effectively to your table or to other keepers, if because it's unusual, right? Or because it's more open. If you're doing something like what Heinrich was describing with more of a sandboxy, I may get in trouble for using that term, but more of a sandboxy approach based on roles and relationships rather than iterative steps. So if you have kind of tips or experiences from playtesting this kind of thing, this different structures, different approaches, things that you did to make that playtesting successful, which will help people who are writing and preparing those kind of materials.
I think it's the same. You just have to make it, well, this sounds simple, but express it to your players in a way that engages them. And it doesn't matter what the form of the scenario is. What they're getting is, I'm getting to play a character and this situation seems interesting. There's something in this situation that excites me. It might be that I've just woken up and I don't know where I am. It might be that, I'm driving up the motorway and there are people chasing me and shooting at me. It might be that, I'm at the reading of some guy's will, but there's got to be something in there that grabs you as a player. And it doesn't matter about the whether it's what we might call a standard kind of scenario or a very innovative one. It's just about grabbing the player's imagination. And I think once you grab the player's imagination by making an interesting situation, then they'll ride along with you. It's like going to see a movie, isn't it? It can be any kind of movie, but as long as it grabs your imagination and it pulls you along with it and you're drawn into it, you're along for the ride and you enjoy it. So I think the question of how you deliver it, I think it's the same for any scenario. It's it's through the things that the same staples that make any scenario engaging.
It's again, I don't think it's news to anyone who's begun writing scenarios for publication in whatever form. But I mean, you're not writing a short story, you're not writing a novel, you're writing a toolkit that somebody else that informs somebody else of your ideas, and the art of writing for role-playing games is conveying your ideas in a form that other people can understand at its basis level. Because if people can't understand your intent with how you want the scenario to run or how you imagine the scenario running, then that's something you need to kind of overcome, because otherwise it won't work. People, me and Paul have worked on scenarios for a long time and worked with other writers before we were working with Chaosium and all that kind of stuff, when we were running lots of convention games and like that, and we would get scenarios and we'd literally have a phone call and go, do you understand what this scenario is? No idea.
Oh Christ, you got a few of them.
20 pages of text. There's clearly a scenario here, but I don't understand it.
What are they supposed to do?
What? Yeah. Where are the players in this? Is often the
Oh yeah.
It literally is kind of, if you take away the stats and you kind of move the text around a bit, it's actually a short story, and the person writing it kind of forgot that players were going to be involved, and it's that kind of, and that's why I say it's a toolkit, because it's about giving the keeper not only the material they need to convey, but also enough ideas to handle when the players get involved. Because it's like, it's like traditional Call of Cthulhu scenarios, the classic kind of old stuff. There was only one way into the scenario. It was like, the players will start here and they will do this, and that's how they go. And this is how it will end. It had one ending normally. You read anything from, back in 1983 to 90, they pretty much had a single start and a single end, and some stuff in the middle that could be moved around perhaps. But we find, I think we've all, got to a point now that actually we need more than that, because we appreciate that players won't all do the same thing. So that's why we try and put in a range of options for how investigators can come into a scenario, different ideas, because we don't know who the players are going to be. We don't know what their characters are going to be. And likewise at the end saying, this is the most likely climax we're going to talk about and how to handle it. But here are some other ways. If the players do this instead, here's how you might run it that way. And by doing that, hopefully you give enough of a breadth of advice at beginning and end for the keeper to tailor it to their group when they do something a little different as well. So I think that's what's, key, I think.
Can I just jump in there? So Mike, you said sometimes it's like a short story when you look at the scenario. And I think this is something people might be able to relate to, is you've got this idea for a story. And I can think back to a specific scenario that I read, not a published one, one that was, we were looking at running. And I looked at it, I thought, this is really engaging. This is really interesting, this situation where these family members and these people that are like their friends, and this weird stuff's happened. And then you get like a few pages in, and it says, and then they call in some investigators. And it's like, why would they do that? No, that some scenarios, I think some situations just make pre-gens.
Yep.
Those family members and their friends. That was like a really tight situation. It'd be great fun playing them. You don't need to bring some others in. That's not true for all scenarios. A lot of scenarios you can have investigators come in. But I think if your scenario lends itself to pre-gens, to a tight set of, you can't do the thing, and then they find they've found something buried in the ice from millions of years ago, and they ring up some private. Can you send some private investigators to have a look at this? No, it's like McCready and all that bunch. They're there. They bloody, and. I couldn't have done full Fathom 5, and you phone up some investigators to see what's going on. So sometimes, if you've created a situation for your scenario that you love and you think this is really good, and you're struggling to see how to fit the player characters in, think, are some of these protagonists I've created that I think are antagonists, even maybe, should they be the investigators? Should I give that? Can I remodel that bit and actually put some of that information in the players' hands and let them play those characters? Would that be more fun?
Yeah, one way of one of the, I think, pieces of advice that doesn't necessarily translate super well from the writing world, which is boy, this story better be the most interesting day in your protagonist's life, right? Like if there's another part of their life that's more interesting, why aren't we reading that book? Well, in a scenario, your investigators need to be the most interesting thing going on. And if you've created a scenario, as Paul was mentioning, where they're not, well, change it. And I would just add that, although I will probably get flack for saying this, you can trust your players somewhat. It is fair to tell players this is the type of game it is, and this is going to help you enjoy it more. You know, if your scenario is sort of a slasher scenario that just vibes on all of those, classic movies, I think it's fine for players to go in with that expectation. I think that they have more fun. And for Fathom 5, I watched 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea right before, playing it, and I was doing sea shanties, and I was having a great time that I wouldn't have otherwise, if I were just making my own sailor on this vessel without further information.
So I want to go on to another aspect of scenario design. We're about a half an hour in, so I want to, I suspect this one may eat up the next half hour, so that's fine. This is what I want to cover. Mike, you mentioned something very dear to my heart, which is that spells, right, and sort of human-driven mythos horribleness or out of context things are really a fun way to do a scenario, really a fun thing to present. And so I wanted to get everyone's thoughts on sort of where to go now with the mythos, right? What's sort of underused, underexplored. You don't have to give away your scenario ideas if you've got them percolating, right? There are probably new ways to use Nyarlathotep. There's probably
9,900, I think.
Yeah, exactly. And one day someone's going to write a scenario about Sweet Ermengarde, and then we can shut the whole operation down. So what's out there that you haven't seen enough of, or that you think would be effective and does not use the sort of same types of characters, antagonists that we've seen?
If I can jump in and just kind of set the cat amongst the pigeons somewhat, I think particularly with the repository in mind, but also with the books that we publish, there's a tradition of using mythos entities created by somebody else. Normally, an author, maybe Lovecraft, maybe anyone, August Deleth, name any mythos or author. And using their stuff, and that's fine. That's what the game was built on. That's the kind of the foundation, and that's cool. And there will always be plenty of that knocking around. But the best, the most underutilized part of the mythos is your brain is coming up with something new, and actually going, we all know the kind of experienced players getting tired of meeting deep ones and ghouls because that's all they ever meet. And oh look, we're going to a seaside town, there must be some deep ones then. Clearly we all know the story of that. So why not just say there's no deep ones in my games? They don't exist, they never existed, and I'm going to do something completely different. I might just use the stats for deep ones, save me some work, but I'll change the names and what they are. In my game they're all, I don't know, tree fairies, I don't know, whatever. But, the mythos is unknowable. So be unknowable and come up with something cool and different and twist your, make your Migos totally different to every other Migo that's ever happened. Call them something else as well. And, free yourself from the mythos is what I'm trying to say. We have been bound by it for over 40 years in this game. And as you say, there are literally only so many stories about deep ones you can tell, so do something else.
Yeah, I think doing something else is good advice. I think that's some, what is that something else? I think that something else is thinking of some spark, an idea that excites you. And that spark of an idea, it might be a rip-off of somebody else's idea that you saw in a film or something else. But once you take that and like develop it and add your own thoughts to it, it's probably going to be unrecognizable from that spark. So don't worry about copying something else, because I think it can be hard to avoid. Also, the whole idea of canon in Call of Cthulhu, I think I heard a friend saying, oh, he doesn't really like Call of Cthulhu because I don't really like the setting. I don't know what that means, because to me, it's not a setting. It's not I mean, there is some canon, but it's not really a canon. It's not really a setting. Working with other licensed properties, as one might, they can be a lot more definitive about the place, about the cast of people, about how things work, about the universe and the way it's set up. To me, I've always just thought, oh, I like that horror film, or I've got this weird idea, I'm just gonna craft that in, and then I end up with some weird stuff going on. I think, well, I'll say the Ithians did it, and then I just kind of bolt a bit of mythos on the end. Sometimes it's not really a Call of Cthulhu. Well, it is a Call of Cthulhu scenario because it's a bit like art. I know it when I see it. It is what I say it is. I think it can be anything. It's just something with a horror vibe. Some things are more Lovecraftian than others, definitely. But I think you can use Call of Cthulhu. I mean, in the Call of Cthulhu rulebook, we've got vampires and zombies. I mean, we don't really think of a traditional vampire story in a Call of Cthulhu game, but you could do. You could do if you want to shake it up. So I'm a big fan of, really, the best thing is the thing that excites you, that makes you want to create a game about it. Yeah.
Yeah, one of the things that I still do when playing Dungeons and Dragons, and I used to do when playing Call of Cthulhu, and I don't think it says anything particularly good about myself, but in Dungeons and Dragons, it can be very tempting to take one of the gazillion numbers of monstrous manuals, open it up, and go, they've never fought this thing before, and look at all these neat powers it has, and this will be a really good tactical or strategic challenge. And I think that's perfectly fine and workable for a lot of Dungeons & Dragons games. I don't think that's a great way of approaching Call of Cthulhu. I suppose it can be, but it hasn't been for me, because often, especially in investigative scenarios, you may not learn the entirety of the story. You may not come to understand what this thing is that you're facing. So even though you as the keeper may have these very different creative monsters because you decided to go to page 197 instead of 184 to find your monster, the investigators only get such a small part of that creature. It might as well have been anything, right? So if you are committed to using a Call of Cthulhu monster from the quote-unquote canon, and you want to do so creatively, my approach has been to try and figure out kind of what the one way of saying it is, what is the essence of the monster, or maybe a better way of saying it is, what's this monster about? What makes it scary? What ability does it have that you can center something around, right? So take Kenyanians, right, who have the power of dematerializing matter. That's an amazing thing, and it deserves to be more than just part of like one fight scene, right? Like that is something that you design something big around of and make it a memorable encounter with this specific creature. I think that's fine. I think if you are in a place where you can sort of just slot any monster in, and you could change them out and choose any number of different monsters, I think that's fine. I think then you don't need to worry about it so much. But if you are struggling with this, one way of going about it is to ask yourself, what am I expecting the monster to do? What do I need it to do? A lot of the time, folks feel like, oh, I want the creature to do this, but I'm using deep ones, and they don't have this power. Well, they can have this power if you want them to, right? But also you can make up something else that has exactly the powers that you need, right? You can make up your own monsters, make it fit the needs of the story that you're telling, or at least the contours of whatever sandbox you're building. And I think people sort of sometimes constrain themselves in ways that they don't need to.
There's just riffing on what Heinrich just said. I mean, there's if you want to see an example of how to do a mythos monster, a well-known mythos monster, slightly differently, the Migo in the stories and in some of the old scenarios, you know, they can go about as humans. You know, they can kind of put the skin on and do that, or even cast a spell, you know, to kind of look like somebody else. Perhaps there's plenty of spells that kind of do that kind of thing. But if you go and read the Disintegrator in Pulp Cthulhu, that scenario, there are Migo in there, but they use human puppets to interact. You know, literally the kind of, because when Alan wrote it, he just thought it would be cool if they were like these dead human meat puppets with these strands coming out of them being, you know, literally kind of pulled by the Migo, just because, you know, when you saw that would be pretty horrible. And he just, you know, would laugh about that kind of thing. So, but that's just taking an ordinary monster and just changing a little bit, you know, in terms of how they interact in this scenario. So I think, you know, it's very easy to kind of just, you know, go a little off the rails with it and be creative in that way. I think is really cool. I did notice one of the questions I thought might be good to answer. It was from Steve asking about one of the cool things about CFC is being part of the mythos. So how do you handle the tension between doing something else with doing something cool with the mythos? Which I guess one way to look at that is to say there's an expectation from the players or even from the keeper that this is a mythos story. How do I make it part of the mythos? Because the people are expecting it to be. And I think that comes back to when I was originally talking about what the intent of the scenario and who's it for. If partly because if you're playing with new players, they don't know the difference between a mythos story and a non-mythos horror story, so it doesn't really matter. If you play with experienced players, then they may have some sort of, you know, kind of feeling that, well, there needs to be the mythos. That's why we're playing Call of Cthulhu. It's kind of, well, actually, just free yourselves from that concept. As Paul said, there's vampires and werewolves and millions of other things you can do with horror that aren't necessarily the mythos. But it's very easy to actually build the mythos in, because it can be anything and everything. It doesn't. You don't have to have a cultist there. You don't have to have, you know, Cthulhu's dreams making this happen. You know, but it could be if it's some, you know, great old one's dreams are actually the cause of why people are acting in this way or why this person does that or whatever. Well, that's your mythos explanation. The players will never find it out, probably. It's just a mystery. And that's the heart of Call of Cthulhu, isn't it?
You could think when Lovecraft was writing like Shadow Out of Time, he thought, oh, there's no deep ones in this. People aren't going to know it's mythos.
Yeah, I mean, if you ever want to waste 6 hours on the internet, you can start a discussion about what's Lovecraftian and what's not.
Yeah.
So I guess I'd say don't worry about it, to be frank. If you and your players all sit there in the group and you're having a cup of tea or a beer, and you're discussing the game, and if you're enjoying it or not, and they're going, oh, we kind of enjoying it, but we thought it'd be more mythos, then get to the bottom of that. And if they basically comes down to, we want to be fighting deep ones and running away from Shantax, that's what we want. And so, okay, listen to your players and play accordingly. But if they're going, no, we don't know what the hell's going on, but we're enjoying it, great.
Yeah, I'm just imagining how frustrating a scene I would have if, you know, we had a deep one or something and it suddenly grew wings, right? Just disgusting wings just coming out of its back dorsal fins, and it took off flying. And the player said, "Well, that's not a deep one. I was with you. I was really enjoying the scenario, and then that happened, and it just took me out of it."
You ruined it, Heinrich.
That's probably not the kind of player, you know, that would work great in one of my games. But Steve had a follow-up question, which is, how cool are they? And very cool indeed, apparently.
Exactly as cool as you were before, which is either going to be heartening or not. And it's, you know, I think that gets back to Mike's point of make something new. right? Even if you're reskinning something with existing stats, because even the players with the best will, if they've been around for a while, may have in the back of their mind, oh, that's deep ones. Okay, cool. Let's do it deep ones. And it, the subversion there can be pleasant or it can be off-putting, but if you change it up so it doesn't immediately set off the deep one alarm in the experienced player's head, then then it can grow wings, it can do whatever it wants. So that's a really good point in favor of that approach.
There's another question which I thought was really interesting. Is there an element of regret in the scenario that puts a mythos artifact at its core rather than a mythos monster? Basically, do you really need to have a monster in every scenario to make it the mythos? And I think we all shake our heads and go, no, you don't. In fact, I often hear, on podcasts, particularly, people talking about, oh, scenario ideas. Well, let's get the Malleus Monstrorum out, pick a monster and make a scenario. And yes, you can do that. And that is very old school. And then there's nothing wrong with it either.
Yeah.
But it is, it's what we've been doing for 40 years. Why not put the monster in the scenario and think of something else? It's why I said, why don't you think about spells? Spells going off. Somebody cast a spell, you never know who cast the spell, and you never know what the spell was, but you're now living in the effect of the spell and you've got to deal with it. There's a scenario. Yeah. No monsters involved. Equally, artifacts, as you say in the question, yes, an artifact. What about a fountain pen filled with the blood from a pit of Len? What does that do? I don't know. It could do something weird. I mean, the mythos is, I think, it's why I keep saying free your mind. The mythos is everything and could be anything. Therefore, just take monsters. If you want to take monsters out of the equation for a while and think about anything else that could be scary, lead to a mystery, kill people off, anything like that, or send people on strange quests and visions, they're all plot fodder to have cool adventures around.
And I'll just add that introducing an artifact to the group, especially in a long-running campaign, can be a great way of seeing more play out of it, because an interesting enough artifact creates interesting choices as to whether you're going to use it, how you're going to use it, how you're going to research it. And sure, you're facing a mythos threat. Maybe this thing you already have can answer that threat. You know that every time you open up the box, something good happens, but you also have a sense that something bad happens. And that right there is then a new scenario, right, as to what happens thereafter. And a fun table conversation of, yes, we should, no, we shouldn't. You know what happened last time.
Well, I mean, that's Heinrich's absolutely great. I mean, that's a great point with an artifact, because it's an inbuilt moral dilemma if you pitch it right. And if you want to really pitch the scenario, forget about the artifact being able to, solve their problem in terms of get rid of the monster or whatever it is. Just have the artifact appear, make it the magic bullet gun. Yep. That basically they find out that if they use it, they get something. We get something cool. We get spells, we get mythos, we just get more. We get stronger. Our characteristics go up. We become really cool, but every time we do it, a rabbit dies or something. Yeah. And and soon the whole land is covered in dead rabbits, and these superhuman kind of mythos investigators are wandering around, punching Shoggoths. Obviously, read into what I'm saying, and you can make the players, the dilemma being the players become the mythos horror. Let them reel out enough rope before the penny drops, and then they realize that they are the ones actually at the center of this, causing the problem. And then what you've got next week is a new set of investigators who come in to take on the old investigators. But you go anyway with it. I mean, that's a brilliant moral dilemma, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I'm going to brag about one table that I ran. We were doing a campaign, and as a warm-up, we ran the scenario Deadlight, which is absolutely one of my favorites. And also, by the way, as an example of not straight investigative horror, there's a lot of other stuff going on there with character dynamics and stuff. So without spoiling it, there's a box involved in the scenario. And I just, at the end of the scenario, I gave the box to one of the characters. And that was it. He, like, that player instantly knew that his investigator was doomed. And it took like 20 sessions for it to pay off. But just the existence of that artifact was like a moral black hole that continually, like, he was game with it. He kind of like would role play, like looking at it and wondering, is this when I should use it? Is this when I should use it? And it eventually destroyed him, as was kind of our, social contract at the table. It's phenomenal. Let the, give the human players tons of rope and let them hang themselves.
And it doesn't have to be mega powerful. A gate box, an empty box that you can go in and go somewhere else. It's a magic travel machine. That's all it does. But think of what you could do with one of those. Need some money? We'll have it open in the bank vault. And then suddenly they're on the slope to being the villains.
Yeah, Bucha, you're in your comment there, you're absolutely right. I mean, the worst thing you can do is give someone a spell. They're just doomed. They're not. That's the mythos element, right? This is not a toy. This is not stuff that humans were meant to play around with. So if you give them, even something innocuous like an elder sign, right? That's it. Sooner or later, they're going to wind up in a really bad place, which I think, any other mythos element aside, right? That's your element of Call of Cthulhu that people want. They want to know that they're doomed in some way. Maybe not even that, but that's good. Also, just as a mechanical thing, I'm going to abuse my moderator power to offer one more idea. If you are the kind of person who likes opening up the Malleus Monstrorum or the Grimoire, but you want to get out of the D&D kind of encounter mindset, look at an entry, skip the combat stuff, and say, what interesting thing happens with all the rest of this bit? Design your scenario around the non-combat piece, and then see where the scares are there. And that's pretty fun. I do that a lot. Okay, sorry about that. One other thing, we had a question earlier from Newman, asking about using folklore merging with the mythos as far as ideas for making a richer mystery. And I know that there's positives and potentially some pitfalls with that, but I wanted to get your thoughts on incorporating, folklore and maybe even urban legends and that kind of thing.
I feel I've spoken too much, so somebody else answer that.
When it comes to folklore and all that, I'm not very well versed on that, really. I latch into some bits and, exploit them where I can in a scenario, maybe just for a bit of set dressing, but it's not something that I'm particularly well versed in. And I find, like, talking to some of the other like mythos authors, the authors of Call of Cthulhu scenarios, we have diverse interests. Just thinking about like me, Matt, and Scott on the podcast I do. It's like the inspiration that we get and the kind of topics that we're interested in, quite different often, and often some of the things that interest one of us leaves the other, quite bored. That said, I think folklore, obviously folklore, if you're going to be looking at folklore, then it steps on into areas of culture, and then into areas of different cultures. So there's a need for sensitivity there, because that can be, perhaps stepping on things that you shouldn't be stepping on. So I think you can utilize those things. It depends how you frame them. So, yep, I'm not sure if that's something we want to get into. But
I can, if I'm just chipping, because I am into folklore and I love all that kind of stuff. So.
You are, yeah. That's kind of what I thought when you said you.
I thought I would.
This is more your area.
He was waiting. He was laying a trap, Paul.
You're laying my trap, really. So yeah, I mean, what Paul has said is what you need to bear in mind. Using folklore can be really cool. I mean, this is the difference between your home game and publishing. In the home game, you can do what you like. And, in the privacy of your own gaming room, I will never know what you do, so I don't care. Yeah.
As long as you apply the rules correctly.
As long as you apply the rules
And you
correctly.
put up
Otherwise,
your
we
words
will
on
be
it.
round.
I will be round. It will be round.
Yeah.
You know, the rules police. But
Yeah.
other than that, but if you're publishing it, then obviously you do need to be aware that, you know, other people are going to read this, hopefully, and therefore, you know, you want to, you know, if you're using, okay, there's history and there's folklore. Yeah, one is fact, one is mythology, but sometimes the two combine to some degree. Yeah, and it's knowing which is which sometimes helps to work out how much you can prod it or change it or how malleable it is. So the easiest way to do it is to say, I really like this bit of folklore. I'm just going to make something up. There's a bit of folklore about the goblin that lives in trees that likes eating gold. Okay, that's the bit of folklore I've decided I think it's going to be really horrific, you know, and therefore I want to use that. However, it's actually an indigenous. It comes from Pakistan. Let's just say, you know, that's a piece of folklore from that region. One, I don't really know enough about that country to write a scenario set there. So I'm not going to do that. I want to set the scenario in Arkham. So I'm using a folklore that doesn't really fit. You see what I mean? So the easiest way to do it is, okay, I'm going to take the idea, but I'm going to change it. So I'm going to change it to the ogre that lives in the thorn bush that likes eating silver. So I'm inspired by it, but I'm not using the same idea. I'm just trying to, you know, make it sound a bit silly to make the point.
I'm going to have nightmares.
You change it, make it your own. Be inspired without copying. Yeah, that's one way. If it's a bit of folklore that comes from your own culture, then I think to some extent that's fine, isn't it? Because, you know, you are coming from a voice with a voice of knowledge and basis, and then it's just down to whether you think it's appropriate. You know, would you be offended if you read somebody else have done this? You know, just think about it like that. But often, you know, you can intertwine folklore in a way, but sometimes it's nice for folklore just to be folklore. You know, there's some really great English folklore, Jenny Greenteeth and things like that, which just for me are really interesting. And I don't need the mythos with that. Just having Jenny Greenteeth turn up as the kind of antagonist in the story, that's great. I mean, it's got no mythos in it whatsoever, but the players don't need to know that. I mean, and if the players bother me about the mythos, then I can just say, well, you know, in years past, Jenny ate some plants that are grown out of the color from beyond. I don't know. You know, therefore it's mythos. You know, some folklore is really strong on its own 2 feet, and I think that's fine. You know, enjoy it. It'd be great scenarios. You know, folklore, folk horror, and all that kind of stuff is all cool for me. But I think the key is what Paul said: is just think about it. Think about how you want to use it. Is it appropriate? Can you do something better by being inspired by it, by rather than just copying it or using what is already known? Because, you know, if it's something already known, then 10 to 1, some players are going to know it as well, and maybe just spoil your scenario because they just go, oh well, you know, you only have to throw, you know, coconuts at it and that kills it in the folklore. So let's go and get some coconuts, you know. So change it, make it your own, like the mythos.
You know, I'm realizing at what a disadvantage I am here, because I'll sort of hear the question, I'll write down a few notes, and then as Paul and Mike talk, you know, I'll just start crossing things off, like, yep, not going to say that, not going to say that. Sensitivity important, you know, be intentional. So sorry, I'm just going to restate a bunch of things, but I'm going to do it. Damn it. Be intentional in using folklore. Know why you're doing it. What role is it playing in the story? Is it intended to convey information? Is it intended to subvert expectations? You know, sometimes we do just have it would be cool to do a scenario about this folklore where the folklore monster is the actual monster in the scenario, and that might get you into a situation where you are telling a ghost story that isn't a ghost story, but maybe it would have been better if it were just a ghost story, you know. A sideways thing I'll say that I don't think has been said yet. One thing that is neat about studying other countries' folklore and other cultures' folklore is you get to see other things that people are afraid of, and the ways in which they are afraid of those things. Because it turns out we probably are also afraid of those things. We're just afraid of them in different ways. But that could give you an angle to approach a fear in a way that is not going to be appropriating another culture, because you're not using the folklore, you are using the underlying thing that provoked the folklore, right? That provoked the fear, and putting it in this different context. And that, I think, can be quite effective.
Excellent, excellent. So I'm going to expand from there with a question from Tristan. We've talked about, presenting folklore in a unique way or engaging people that may not have the interest in it. And it's sort of a cousin to this other question about using historical settings or a different geographical setting. And especially, I think, Tristan, we're talking about writing for the repository or as a, keeper for your table, the right amount of information to give to establish the setting, to establish the important tensions and themes, right? Without, making someone read a history book or giving 30 minutes of exposition at the table. I'm going to start with Heinrich, because I know that you are working on something that uses a setting that not all that many people may be familiar with.
I don't necessarily know what you mean.
Your project that you've posted about.
The Carcosa guy.
Yeah. Okay. See, because you said you did it in public, so I can mention it here.
You can. I've got designer diaries up that reflect my thinking as I go about this. Yeah, I mean, what you described as the keeper reads 30 minutes of exposition, right? Certainly not the way to go about it. I think, to borrow another analogy from writing, right? The showing, not telling school of thought of, is there a way that you can convey information in ways that are more subtle? Either they are part of a player handout, for example, or you are playing off of players' expectations, because a lot of the time, if you say, right, you go into a forest, most of us have some mental image of what a forest looks like. Well, you can do that with a lot of things and save yourself a lot of exposition. I also, I'm a big fan of players adding to the setting, and what types of things are in the woods? Well, I didn't tell you that there's a branch by you, but probably there's a branch by you, and you can just make use of that, right? In the specific context you were asking about, this sort of Carcosa guide, which is kind of the solo adventure story, there the challenge of setting is making sure to include descriptions that are appropriate for a solo player to read, right? But not so long that you end up reading a book. And there, it's just really a matter of if you find yourself, whether it's a solo scenario or an actual scenario writing, and you're finding yourself going, and then the keeper conveys this one paragraph description of the room, step back, rethink, see if the room deserves a paragraph. Maybe it does, right? I do think it's true that whatever you are spending the most time writing or explaining in your scenario, that better be the focus, right? That is telling me as the reader, this is what I need to care about. There's a whole lot of text here. I need to read it. I need to digest it. It's going to be important. And sometimes we write and explain things that aren't that important. And knowing the difference is, practice, trial and error, and part of what makes this a challenge, of course. Sorry, that was not.
No, that was good. That's a good way in. That's a good way into it.
I'll leave it there.
For Paul and Mike, when we're dealing with the 1850s at sea, or when we're dealing with down darker trails, right? If we're writing for an official Chaosium supported setting, or if we're writing for our own setting, how are we balancing focusing on the important details with the perverse delight that everybody has in a 30-page appendix of prices for goods and sundries?
Yeah, I think one of the
which
things
is also part of the hobby, right?
One of the things I think people broadly enjoy in Call of Cthulhu is some historical detail. And as Heinrich said, it doesn't need to be loads. It's just enough to give a picture. I don't think all the text on the page necessarily has to be conveyed directly to the players. It can be to inform the keeper. And if the keeper's got good picture of it in their head, then they can, answer questions to the players about the setting, particularly if it's kind of an unusual setting. One that, if it's 1920s America, then I can blag that. But if it's, I don't know, 1750s Paris, I need a bit more to fill me in, to give me a picture of it. And then, I can probably paint a picture to the players then. One of the things, funnily enough, I was talking to Mike earlier this week about this. One of the things I like to know when I'm reading the scenario and there's historic stuff, or is this a historic event, or is that real? Did that stuff really happen? I want to know. As a reader, I want you to tell me what's real and what you've made up, because I don't want to have to go like looking it up as well. Just tell me this. Okay, the stuff I'm writing about in this part, all this stuff is actually true. Oh, great. Well, I know that now, and I can respect that. Whereas if you made it up, that's perfectly fine as well. But I'm going to treat that in an appropriate manner. There's also, as we were talking about cultural sensitivity, there's historical sensitivity. I think if you're talking about events that happened, I think the more recent it happened, the more careful you've got to be. So if you're talking about an event that happened, say, 10 years ago, in which a bunch of people died in real life, I'm going to say you probably shouldn't be writing that. Because they might be a relative of a reader. It doesn't really matter if they're a relative of a reader or not. You've got to think about that. And how far does that go back? What happened in the 1960s? Okay, well, if it happened like 200 years ago, suddenly that feels a bit different. So as Mike said, you can take those things and you can change them. So you can have a parallel to it. But I'm thinking of a particular scenario, a big world event that happened, where a bunch of people died. And I can remember you stamping down on it, Mike, and saying, no, we can't do that. And one of the authors couldn't see your point, but I think you were right. So I think that's perhaps a sideline to historical context.
No, it's important.
But in terms of the amount of detail, enough for me to get a handle on it.
Can I give? Oh, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead, Heinrich. Yeah.
I thought of one example, and I was really excited about it. And I want to jump in before Mike says everything else there is to say about the topic, which he likely will. A lot of the historical information to us seems overwhelming because we're just thinking about it as a history book, as opposed to why does it matter for the scenario? And the real world artifacts that existed and did not exist at that time can be a way of getting players into the setting. So Paul's scenario on whaling is a great example. I was thinking of Beyond the Mountains of Madness, which has sort of this, I don't know, 50 plus pages on polar expeditions, right? And Arctic expeditions and all the tools that they used. And it's incredibly interesting. And I loved reading it. A lot of it I didn't use, right? I didn't make people explain to me exactly, okay, how many layers are you putting on? Are you wiping off your, glasses so they don't fog up, so they don't turn to ice, so they don't cause snow blindness, something like that. But there was one thing that I did use that I found just brilliant, which was oxygen tents. It's a thing that I didn't know about, but you know what? It is something that impacts the story. It's something that the players, the investigators have to plan around, and it's something that can go delightfully wrong and lead to more terrible creative decision making. But using that immediately gets players in a certain mindset that they wouldn't have otherwise. Because again, I never thought about oxygen tents, maybe with the Himalayas, but not in the Antarctic context. And so that was just that one example I wanted to call out.
And I think that's a great example, Heinrich, of something that sparks your imagination. So I think it's the job of the keeper to give the players, possibly what, Heinrich?
Possibly literally in the case of an oxygen tent.
Yes, I think it's the job of the keeper to spark the players' imagination, and it's the job of the players to do that to each other. But primarily, perhaps the keeper in the scenario to fire up their imagination. And once you say oxygen tent, I mean, well, you're away, aren't you? As you say.
It's a great word, oxygen tent. Yeah, if you say that word in the scenario, you know it's going to be good.
Especially if the players say, "Can we have an oxygen tent?" Yeah, don't you can have 3.
So
And take a box of matches too.
I've been thinking about this question about, what I've kind of interpreted it as, if we're going to use a non-standard setting, something a little bit less known, to us, as it were, or to the reader, what do I need to think about? How do I do it appropriately, and convey the information that's going to be useful? And the trick to my answer is, I've just said it, convey information that's going to be useful. So I've written down, this is your cheat sheet. You can't see it with the light on, but I'll try it. No, it's too light. Oh no, you can't read it. Sorry.
Put it in chat.
I'll read it to you. So basically, when I'm mapping out a new place, yeah, and or a writer is asking me about, that this is their plan for the book they want to write, and this is the things they're going to cover. I have this little checklist to see whether they've covered what's going to be useful to the game. And what I mean by that is going to be useful to the players. So one is travel. How do I get around? And if it's a city, how do I get around in the city? And then how do I get into or out of the city? Think, the far west in Down Darker Trails, or in Dark Ages. How do I get to France? Who are the police, if there are any? What is the law? Because investigators are going to interact with that in some way, even if it's just trying to skirt it or not avoid getting caught. So you need to know what is the situation, because the players are going to want to know. You're going to know, what is the medical situation? Where are the hospitals? Are there any? What is the level of care? Because that's a game mechanic, as in, when my players have all been half eaten, they're going to look for someone to heal them. Where do they go? I don't want to make that on the fly, because it's got to be part of the setting. Where are the libraries? For obvious reasons. Where is the information? Dark Ages, there's no libraries. So where's the information? It's in people's heads, it's in monasteries, and etc., etc. And then generally, just these are lesser importance, but you kind of got to know is, what do people do? What is work in this environment? Yeah, because in Down Darker Trails, it's really, it's kind of quite varied, because you can have people, in saloons and stores, but also you've got snake oil men, which have got scenarios written all over them, and so on and so on. And also, and leading on from that, what are shops? Are there shops? Can you buy dynamite? Can you buy guns? Can you buy oil lanterns? How does that work? Yeah, because these are all things players are going to ask you for. Therefore, you need to cover them. Even if it's only just a paragraph saying, yeah, there are no hospitals there, they're on their own. I know that now and can get on with it. But I don't want to spend 20 minutes in the middle of a game because a character's mortally wounded, looking for where's the hospital? I can't remember where it was, and because it's not there.
Yeah.
So that's my take on settings, prepping them. The other thing on the history site, which kind of riffs off but what the other guys have just said, is about historical real people. Paul's kind of covered the whole kind of like, let's not do the such and such murders or whatever that are in living memory. Just make something else up. Be inspired, but do your own thing. But historical characters, there's different trains of thought. I mean, my personal view on it is historical characters should act like they did in their history. So I don't think Queen Victoria was a mythos wizard, and should never be, because that doesn't really go with her character. Because I mean, why even bother? Why just create somebody else to do that? Equally,
Sherlock Holmes could do kung fu though, right?
Yeah, kung fu. And he had a TARDIS, didn't he? The obviously the ripe cherry of historical figures is obviously the one and only Aleister Crowley. But like we did with the Berlin book, Crowley can be in your scenarios if it's, you know, appropriate to the era. He lived through the Gaslight Age and is in the 1920s and beyond. You know, he's there for the taking, you know, and why wouldn't you want to use him? But what I'm trying to say is, yeah, use him, but don't make the scenario about him. He's a known quantity. Yeah, he will spend his life, you know, living off the expenses of the investigators and leading them on, going, oh yes, of course I can have it. Oh yes, I know all these things. And yes, I'll have another brandy, please, which you're paying for. That's Aleister Crowley. And then he did magic. He did it on his own. He didn't invite all his mates round. He just went off and did it. So use them as they are. Don't foist these fictions on them, I guess. If you've got fictions, that's what NPCs are that you create from scratch. That's what they're there for. And again, they can be, you know, you can create an Aleister Crowley-like figure. That's fine. But have Aleister Crowley be Aleister Crowley is my advice in anything like that.
And again, abusing my mod powers to offer a piece of advice. We can borrow here also from film. When you're watching a film, especially set in a particular city, particular time and place, there's always the establishing shot, right? Before the characters do anything, they do like the pan over the city, they zoom in, you see, you know, cars or horse-drawn carriages or people on horses or wagons, whatever it is. But in like 30 seconds of visual time, the filmmaker has situated you in a time and a place and has given you actually most of the things that Mike mentioned, you know, travel, what the layout of the place is, you know, maybe some indication of law and order or whatever the hot thing is. And a keeper can probably accomplish that in a minute or two of description and introducing a scene. And as a writer, you can probably do that in a couple of paragraphs when you set up a given scene. So, you know, go cheat and watch some of those establishing shots and pay attention to how much information is being conveyed without a word being said, really.
If you want to go really cheap, use your pre-gens. Right, include background information about the setting in your pre-gens. Have the players read it because they want to figure out which character to play, but actually they're getting information about what was medicine like because one of the characters is a nurse or a doctor or whatever.
It's a really good point. I mean, just to kind of, you know, lift the veil for 1 second. I've said this publicly in the past, and it's not really a big reveal, but we do have a science fiction setting for Call of Cthulhu in development, and we've got it in development for a little while because it's really, for me, the pinnacle of trying to convey a setting that no one gets or understands. Because you say, well, you know, any sci-fi role-playing game out there already, you know, what is it? Because it's sci-fi, it could be anything. Is it, and you go like, well, is it Star Trek? Is it Star Wars? Is it Event Horizon? It could be any of these. Because it means everything. So when you're doing a setting that is unknown, there's no history to it because it's in the future, you have to describe everything because you're world building. You know, we don't have to world build very much in Call of Cthulhu because we just say it's the 1920s. Go and look on Wikipedia. You know, but when it's that, so when you're literally first playing this sci-fi setting, you've got to convey to the players the entirety of the setting. How do you do that without boring them to death? Because the keeper's now said, I'm going to monologue for 4 hours to just get you the setup of what the future looks like, which is like the death knell for any game ever. How do you do that? So Heinrich is a really good idea. You know, build that into character generation. So you kind of, as you're going through that, very first thing you do as a player, you start to get a feel for the setting in your choices that you're making. The other trick we've used, and we use this in Children of Fear and a few other things and pieces, where there is there's kind of a little bit more information than can be, well, the keeper could say it, but we try to not get them to monologue. So we just make it into a handout, you know, just make, and I try and have this rule of, like, you know, when it's setting information, it should never be more than one side of paper, because otherwise, you know, ideally half a side really, but you know, more than one side and people, you know, fall asleep. But So that's one of the things, one of the things we're trying to incorporate into the sci-fi kind of thing is like, what is one piece of information we can give them in the shortest possible literature. This is the first thing. Go and read this before you think about your characters, to just get your mind in gear for the setting that it is. And sometimes you have to do that. And I'm using that example as a sci-fi because you can appreciate no one knows what that setting is. Yeah, and can never know until they read it.
So we've got about 12 minutes left. I know it's late for the UK. John Crowdis had a question about whether it's helpful to overlay a fictional location on top of an historical one. Am I understanding, John? Am I understanding correctly? Is this like, how faithful do you have to be to actual historical locations? Is that sort of a reasonable interpretation of your? Okay. So again, you've all done historical books. You've had experience with balancing historical accuracy versus useful to the keeper materials. So your thoughts on that.
I'll mention one example, which is my scenario, The Great Trap, is in, spoiler, an observatory, right? It turns out I knew very little about observatories. They are very cool, deep Wikipedia rabbit hole to go down. But in that scenario, I very upfront sort of say, hey, this is based on the history of this real life observatory that's not currently functioning. And I used schematics from it as a starting point, and then just started deleting rooms and moving rooms where I needed them to. And I found it helpful. I found it a good constraint, because I wanted it to be an observatory, but it was a jumping off point, and I didn't feel bad about modifying it. I changed the names, I changed all the historical characters and things like that, and they were different from the history. So it was a jumping off point. So I think it is very dependent on what is useful to you. And once you realize you're getting to a point where, oh, I'm feeling hemmed in by it, jump ship. And don't feel so constrained by it, so long as you change everything sufficiently that we're not depicting historical events, and we're not talking about recent things. That's how I've gone about it anyway.
I mean, the thing about, again, it's fact and fiction. If you're using a building plan for a real building, the question is, are you using the plan of the building because that real building is in your scenario as that real building? So let's just say it's the Tower of London. Yeah. The Tower of London is your scenario. So you've managed somehow to get a blueprint of the Tower of London, and but you want it to have some secret passages that aren't clearly there. Well, that's fine, isn't it? I mean, it's a Tower of London. It's a public kind of building. It's not like, I don't think it's a big issue. And again, it's kind of how much fact do you want in your fiction? The more fact you have, the less free you are to change things. In a sense, you're constrained. The only person constraining you is you by saying, I'm keeping to this. It's like Heinrich says, be inspired by it. But once you not start needing in to build, the secret 13th floor, then that's the heart of the scenario, because nobody knows it's there because it's in the scenario, because it's secret. That's cool, so don't worry too much about that. I guess the issue I think that you have as a writer and a keeper sometimes is, I've created this thing in this place that's real, based on a real thing. What if the players turn around and go, you got that wrong? Is that what that often is the kind of motivation you can hear in your head go, but what if somebody says, because I ran a game once, I set an adventure in some village I'd never been to in northern England, and guess what? One of the players was born there. Yeah, and I just made all I'd used is the name of the village. That's the only thing that was real. Everything else was a fiction. But the player was born there, and literally kind of looked at my village map that I put on the table going, oh, it's not quite right. And I said, why? Oh, it's just I was born there. So, oh, okay. Well, I just made it all up. So, oh, that's fine. And then he shut up and just enjoyed the scenario. You know, it's about communication then with the player at that point. But I mean, using real floor plans is a really good thing because it means your buildings act like real ones.
Oh yeah.
Rather than role play floor plans, which are often even some old Cthulhu scenarios.
Love it.
Yeah, they ain't really, they don't work.
Yeah, murder room.
Where do they keep all their clothes? Where do they have a bath?
Where do they go to? Where do they go
horror,
to the toilet? There's like there's no bathroom.
This building is
It's like,
impossible.
it's like gaslight buildings. It's like, if it's a middle class or above abode, where do the servants live? Where do the horses? How does the coal from the coal cart get into the house? Because these things that we don't think about because we don't have to deal with them in our lives.
Yeah.
So we don't even think about them when we're drawing a floor plan. But if they were there in Gaslight, the fact that most houses didn't have a toilet, they were an outside toilet, is an important fact.
Kind of off topic, but one thing, if you're going to start describing a location, describing a house, start with the map. Look up the map, look up the floor plan first, then describe it. Because if you describe the house, then try and find a floor plan that fits, you're making a rod for your own back. You really are. Yeah. It's a nightmare.
The times I have spent looking at the map I've been sent with the text I've been sent and going, but they're two different things.
That feels a little
and then
personal.
I'm having to redo both map and text to make them actually work together. It's kind of like, please don't do that. Do what Paul says. Do a map, then write about it.
And also the floor plans you get, unless you are a cartographer or an architect, the floor plans you get, they're going to look like actual floor plans of actual houses, like Mike said. They're not. If I make one up, it doesn't look like a real house.
Just from a research side, for the US, the Library of Congress has a ton of historical preservation stuff, free PDFs of floor plans and architectural photos and everything. I imagine that like the National Trust has similar things, in the UK and other places. So you can get them, if you look up like a famous example of the kind of house you want, if it's above a certain age, those plans are usually part of whatever application was made to preserve it. So that should all be available for free, unless it's like a private house or something.
And speaking of ways of being creative and where to get ideas, go to Wiki Commons, type in asylum floor plan, and there's your evening. And a lot of the time, if you're looking at a map, you start seeing possibilities for stories just develop by virtue of the layout, by virtue of those historical details that we wouldn't have been aware of, but now you're thinking about where the coal comes from. And maybe something is impacting the coal going into all of these houses, because that was a whole mechanic.
Because the Shoggoths eaten all the coal and has gone into all the sacks. So what they're doing is just loading every house up with their own little Shoggoth now. Yeah. That's how it's getting around.
Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah. Mike, I don't think we have any other questions. What in like a minute or two, if you're comfortable revealing a book that's 13 days from publication, how did you get across, you and Andrew and Lynn, right? How did you get across the Regency vibe? Like what setting details really popped that you feel comfortable sharing? You don't have to review the whole book.
Sure. I mean, really it was Andrew and Lynn. I just came in at the end and did my fiddling around with things, but it's because it's very similar to Gaslight. It's obviously not that similar, but it is very similar in terms of comparing it to the 1920s. It's conveying what the sensibility of the setting is, rather than what the setting is, if you see what I mean. So the setting, so we talk about there's a single page near the beginning of the book that's literally called Jane Austen's England, and it just describes that. Because if you're a Jane Austen reader or you watch films, you know this already. But it says, this is stories about people that live in big country houses. This is about the middle class and upper class, not about working people. Although they are involved, your investigators are going to be, because we're telling Austen-esque style stories, therefore it's Austen-esque style characters. So it's that kind of setup to kind of get you, get your head in the right mindset for that kind of style of game, as opposed to Gaslight, where in previous editions it said that kind of thing. This is about investigators from middle class and upper class, not lower class or working class. The new edition of Gaslight is because I really hated that, because actually I think the most interesting stories are the ones about the working class, because they can do a lot more in Victorian England than anyone else can. So, you know, we've changed that on its head in the new edition of Gaslight that's coming out. That you know, actually, yes, you can still play, you know, middle class doctor and all the rest of it if you want to, or the Lord of the Manor. However, there is now all this extra information about the working class kind of occupations and options and cool ideas for those in scenarios as well. Which is a backwards way of saying, you know, Regency is trying to do it in a very, very concise way without, because once you understand it's about country houses and middle class folk, I don't need to tell you a lot more,
right,
other than, you know, etiquette is a thing, you know, rules of society are a real thing, even more so than in Gaslight. You know, it's already starting to break down by Gaslight time, but, you know, etiquette is king. Those are the key strands of the story, and that's what we try and convey, and try not to spend too long doing it, to be honest.
And so I will just add or emphasize that for everyone who's working on historical things or a town, you know, region in the country that's not often done, don't neglect the social history. And maybe even focus on that more than the architecture, right? Because people, I think, have an idea in their heads of what a place looks like, but they may not have an idea of what it feels like, and especially not for the classes, you know, the working class or other type of people like that. So if you only have room for a little bit, focus on the feel of it, and let people kind of improvise the other bit. Okay, that's the last time I will abuse my powers, except for now, when I will thank everyone for your participation. This was incredible. This could have been 6 panels, and one day it will be. So thank you for the beginning of this conversation that will, I'm sure, go on next year. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great questions. Thanks very much.
Mhm.